We believe that better brains create better leaders, but today I'm changing that belief to say better hearts create better leaders. I have the privilege to be interviewing in this program Dr. Jonathan Fisher from Charlotte in the US. How are you, Jonathan, today?
Oh, Sylvia, it's a wonderful day, beautiful weather, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. It's really exciting to have this conversation. The brain and the heart, we can't separate them. We
That's
have to
right.
talk about both together, right?
Yes, exactly right. So I have so many questions for you, and I'm pretty sure that whoever is listening to this program will be interested to know the things that cardiologists know, but most people wouldn't know, right?
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah, and I'm happy to share. Yeah, and most cardiologists don't necessarily talk about these things we're going to talk about today. I'm hoping we can change that.
exactly. So let me first introduce you properly. So Dr. Jonathan Fisher, he's a clinical cardiologist, mindfulness and meditation teacher, and organizational well-being and resilience leader at Novant Health for a team of 38,000 people. That's pretty impressive, Jonathan.
Mm. It's a lot of people, and it's a privilege, and it's one that I'm very grateful to have.
Yes, absolutely. So he has delivered keynotes and workshops on heartful leadership, stress mastery, and total well-being for teams and organizations across America and globally, including companies like IBM, Bank of America, IE Business School, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, along with universities and healthcare organizations. In 2020, he co-founded the Ending Physician Burnout Global Community and organized the world's first global summit dedicated to ending physician burnout with over 1,000 participants from 43 countries. He's about to release his first book, Just One Heart: How to Train Your Mind and Heal Your Heart. It's in pre-sale now, right?
Yeah, so it'll be out early 2024.
Okay, fantastic. I'm looking forward to reading your book. And this is a little bit of, a, having a sense of what the book will tell us and also know more about your story and your background and what took you to this point.
Hmm. So my background is as the youngest of 7 children.
Wow.
And my mother and father taught us that science is something we should really honor and respect. My father was a chemical engineer and then became the town doctor for a small town where I grew up in New Jersey. And my mother always wanted to be in the sciences. She ended up becoming a nuclear physicist back in the 1950s in America when that was very unusual for women to
Wow.
do.
That's
And
amazing.
so she really was pushing for women's rights in education and science and in society. And she had 3 daughters and 4 sons. And one by one, we followed my parents' example. And
So,
one by one, we became physicians. So
mm,
by the time I came around, I was already in love with physics and biology, chemistry, not so much. And when it was time to decide what I wanted to do with my life, I realized that practicing medicine would be a way to help other people, made me feel
mm.
good also. And specifically, practicing cardiology allowed me to use some knowledge of physics and hydromechanics and all the fun things that we learned in school.
And what did you learn through your career as as a cardiologist? What are some of the
Hmm.
nuggets that can illuminate other people's mind?
Yeah. So what I learned is that many of us don't think about our hearts until there's a problem. It's like so many things.
Yes.
And often we don't treat our hearts very well. And
Hmm.
some of us may not exercise, we may not eat healthy, we use comfort food to deal with stress and pain. Some of us smoke cigarettes, we drink too much alcohol, we sit on the couch and watch Netflix. And so there's an epidemic right now. And what I'm learning is that between obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure, we have a major health crisis in the world. So that heart disease now is the #1 killer of women and men
Wow.
everywhere in the world. And
Mm.
so this is what I'm learning is that it's happening because we are out of connection with our hearts, with our physical hearts. And then the second lesson that I learned is that it's not enough to simply take care of the physical heart with enough sleep and nutrition and exercise. That's hard enough to stay motivated and to have healthy habits. What I saw in my clinic is that many patients would exercise and eat right, and they'd still come with heart attacks. And the question is, what's going on here? And it led me to realize that what many people have realized for thousands of years is that the physical heart is connected with the emotional heart. And the emotional heart is also influenced by our social connections and our spiritual connections. So the name of the book is Just One Heart, which is a new holistic approach to healing our hearts, not just the physical, but also the emotional. So what I'm learning is that we've come a long way in cardiology. We can now put a new valve in someone's chest instead of doing open heart surgery. We can do miraculous things, but some of the basics are still missing, which is having empathy and compassion and prioritizing our social relationships.
So this is obviously extremely interesting, and I have always wondered, we have neurons in our heart, and is there any analysis on the difference between people who are very compassionate to those who aren't? Do they have more neurons? Are their connection, is the connection with the brain different to people who are completely detached from their emotions?
It's such a great question, Sylvia. And I think one of the secrets in my learning journey is to say when I know something and when I'm sure of it and when I don't know. And I think any good, humble scientist who's asked that question will say, there's still a lot that we don't know. If you go back to the 1990s, there were some scientists who were exploring the human heart, and they were counting the neurons in the heart and looking at connections between mind and brain. And of course, the heart has nerve cells, just like the brain has nerve cells. Every part of our body has nerve cells. It's how we have awareness. What's different between the heart and the brain is consciousness. And there are people who debate, does the heart have its own consciousness? I don't think it has consciousness in the sense that the brain does. It requires the specialized connections of neurons. So to answer the question you asked, which is, do people who are more compassionate have different hearts? Certainly in the metaphorical, emotional sense, yes, absolutely. People who are more compassionate tend to see less separation between themselves and other people. They tend to have more of a sense of belonging in the universe and connection with nature. And they tend to have an overarching concern for the well-being of other people. What we do know, and you know this from neuroscience, is that people who are more empathic and compassionate have different brains. And the brains that are different communicate with the hearts in different ways. So if someone is more avoidant and fearful and less concerned about others, their amygdala may be more active. If somebody is more empathic with the feelings of another person, the anterior insular cortex in the brain tends to be either more developed or more active, depending on what kind of scans we look at. People who are more compassionate, and they've studied people who train in compassion. A Buddhist monk named Matthew Ricard, the happiest man on earth, he wrote a book on altruism.
Yeah.
When you apply EEG and other studies, they find that the left prefrontal cortex is more active when people are exerting empathy and compassion, as opposed to the more primal parts of the brain when we're feeling more disconnected. So that would be activity in the amygdala, also in the default mode network, for example.
Yes. I follow Dr. David Wallman from Arizona University, where they did a study on inspirational leaders, and they did find a correlation between how calm is your heart and how coherent is your heart, that influences the brain to be more inspirational. That's why people will follow you more. So that's another interesting take on the connectivity between the heart and the brain.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The connection between the heart and the brain, there are many different highways of information. So there's nerves, and there's also chemicals, and there's also energy.
Mm-hmm.
And there is good research now that if you or I start having a faster heartbeat, before we're aware in our mind that the heart is beating faster, we may develop a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of excitement in the brain. And then as we process the emotion, just like we process any emotion, we create a story around what's happening inside of us. One leader whose heart is beating faster may start telling a story of, I'm so nervous, I'm so anxious, I'm afraid, and then that will perpetuate the rapid heart rate, and then we end up stuck in a cycle. Whereas another leader, for example, who may feel something may interpret that as excitement, preparation, readiness to lead other people. And so there isn't a story in the brain that perpetuates. Instead, it's one that helps calm the heart down. I also know that if I am around you and if I am very anxious, you will pick up cues even before I speak in the expressions in my face, in how I'm moving, and even in the tone of my voice. We have evolved to detect whether the people we are with are anxious or whether they're calm and courageous. And I think this accounts for the social almost infectiousness of emotions, so which is very, very well described in the leadership literature, that emotions can spread from one person to another in the workplace and at home.
Yes. And to be honest with you, I'm quite a calm person, but today my heart was racing a little bit before this interview. So, what does this mean, doctor?
You asked a great question, which is, I think, a question that more of us should ask, Sylvia. You asked a question, you said, what does this mean? And in other words, I think so often we jump to conclusions. We're feeling nervous, we're feeling something in our stomach or tightness in the shoulders, and right away, by default, we assume that it's the worst case scenario. Something bad is happening. And by pausing and taking a stance of curiosity about our own internal experience, we often can get to a more accurate interpretation of these sensations, which is just very primitive information, often misinterpreted by our brains, which then creates anxiety where there was none.
Yes. And, we don't have to believe every thought we have. And because if we don't break it apart, we could even be, I want to use the word channeling in this case, the thoughts of other people that are around us. So sometimes we may pick up the anxiety of someone else. Emotions are contagious, and I guess that the influence of a heart, that has certain patterns of emotions could transfer to you. So as a leader of a team, you may have experienced that. Like when you're in a good mood and you are exuding positive energy and positive emotions, people tend to follow you more.
It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true, Sylvia. It really goes both ways. We tend to focus on the negative example of if someone is nervous, then they tend to get everyone else excited. But I think what you were referring to is something that's so useful, is that if we can adopt a sense of real calm, not fake calm, not fake positivity, but a sense, an internal sense of connection with other people, a sense that things are going to be okay, a growth mindset, so we're not worried so much when things go wrong. That sense of steadiness and calm can be spread like a virus around you. And so your whole team then feels more calm. In the work that I do, it comes up in the emergency room. So they'll give a call and they'll say someone is coming in and their heart has stopped. So someone is dying and the whole team has to be ready. The emergency room doctor, nurses, technicians, all waiting in the room. And the behavior of the leader of that team determines the behavior of the rest of the team, which then determines the effectiveness, the efficiency, and even sometimes the outcomes of this person's life. So it can be a matter of life and death, also in the military.
Yes.
It can be a matter of life and death. Even if we don't take such an extreme example, if we look in the business world or in the technology world or in marketing and branding, teams that work best have a sense of calm, a sense of interconnectedness, and a sense of trust, as opposed to a sense of guardedness, scarcity, and fear.
Yes. And one of the largest studies that Google has done trying to identify what makes a team a high performing team wasn't about the qualifications of each of the members or the dynamics per se, but they have to do with people being nice to each other. That was the conclusion of 10 years of analyzing team behavior. And how is it possible that knowing all of this information, I guess not everybody knows about this, but how is it possible that being nice is not considered as a cool quality and people continue to be defensive or aggressive, or they are opinionated and they may hurt others along the way? How can we change this?
So you're asking a really important question. And I think the answer for me gives me a lot of comfort. I don't feel as guilty because I'm often not nice, Sylvia. I'm going to be perfectly honest. There's times when I may snap or yell at my children, and I may not be kind to my wife or the people I work with, even though I study this and I practice it.
Okay.
So if I struggle with this, we know that, and a lot of people that I know who are very kind also struggle with it. I think it comes down to evolutionary psychology. It has to do with our beliefs and our understanding about the way humans are wired. And we've evolved over millions of years, yes, on the one hand, to be kind, and on the other hand, to compete with each other. And there isn't one without the other. We can't turn off the switch that tells us to perceive danger. We can't turn off, and we wouldn't want to turn off that part of us
Yeah.
that is a
You'll be
little bit
dead.
fearful, that may be anxious. And so your question, I think, is about where are we evolving to? What's the next stage in human evolution, is the way some people have put it, whether it's in the workplace or not. And I really think that it's, do we choose to lean into the higher parts of our human nature, the better angels of our nature, which are the heart-centered qualities of kindness, empathy, compassion, altruism, forgiveness, or do we stay stuck in the easier, more primal, primitive habits of avoidance, fear, competition? And I don't have the answer. I'm curious, Sylvia, what do you think is the answer? How can we create a more kind and compassionate society if we have both of these urges?
I think that one of the key elements that I always share with my clients is that this capacity of developing metacognition, noticing your thoughts and your emotions moment to moment. So when you're able to detach yourself from that primal response, then you're better prepared to bring the kindness into the situation and look at what's going on between you and the other person from a different angle. And that gets achieved by meditation, which takes your brain into 8 to 10 hertz, very low alpha, and you are able, even amidst of chaos, to think about the situation very fast and then tailor your approach so you don't hurt people along the way. And I think that most of us, all of us, should get trained into this type of practice, because that's the only way to change our primal reactions, which protect us. But in most cases we don't need to be protected from the person that we work with, or our parent, or our partner, or our children. So that's what I would say. It's a continuous work in progress, and something that we need to learn to do.
Beautiful. I'm totally with you. And I'm excited to see that just this week, New York City has introduced practices of mindfulness, meditation, and breath work in small children, which is when
Yes.
we have to start this.
Yes.
We can learn it when we're 50 and 60. And I also think that if we introduce it into the earliest education, then the children go home and they teach their parents how to use the
right.
breath to calm the nervous system. But
Yeah.
most of us don't get this education.
No. So the change in the education system or the curriculum is important across the world, because it's happening across the world. I was just reading some reports of bullying in schools here, and it's unnecessary. And we're not training the children to behave any differently. So it's a bit of a problem. But thanks God there are people like you that are pushing towards a kinder world, and it's very important. So tell us a bit.
Sylvia,
Yeah.
oh, I was going to add one other piece of this part
Yeah.
of the
Sure.
conversation. So I think that the question of how can we create a kinder, more compassionate world has different answers depending on who we're trying to encourage, right?
Mhm.
For some people who were born more naturally to have personalities like this, it doesn't take much convincing. But in the business world, I think we have a certain way of doing business. People are calling for a revolution in the way we do business. And beginning, industrial revolution, but particularly in the 1970s and 80s in America, and the economist Milton Friedman said that the purpose of business is to make money. And
That's
that's
right.
the only purpose, is to serve the stakeholders. And so unless we question that assumption, which is core to how capitalism has functioned in the past, we won't be addressing the majority of people in the world who are in the workplace. So we have to include, how do we shift our conception of conscious capitalism? And that's a whole nother conversation, but it's
It is.
it's part of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. I think that the environment, as you know, has a huge influence in our behaviors and even our brain. So the more competitive you make your KPIs, it's not going to elicit the best responses and the best compassionate behaviors from people. I think it's more about, it's a philosophical question. It's like how much we prioritize money and power, and can we distribute a bit more rather than trying to keep it all for ourselves, whoever is in that position. So, until we question those things, and the problem is the people who hold the power not necessarily do metacognition or do mindful meditation because they are successful for whatever reason, and they achieve what they are achieving, so they don't question themselves if that's right or wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think there's three ways to make the case. At least when I'm working with leaders who maybe this is a bit of a weird woo-woo concept. One of them is the financial case, and that's been made very well. People like Dr. Steven Cisiak in his book Compassionomics, where he lays out the financial case for being kind. The other one is by all the authors who write about empathy and the positive psychological benefits. It feels better to be kind. We all know that. It's more of an expansive feeling. And then for those of us in the scientific world, I can make the case that when we are kinder, our physical health is better. And this is just a fact. We suffer less heart attack, high blood pressure, diabetes, and other maladaptive behaviors because we experience less stress when we're more connected with others. So we can make the case so that as a society, we move in a direction that may be, from an evolutionary standpoint, 50-50.
Well, we have to keep, moving the dial. And one of the things that probably is important to acknowledge is we have different networks in the brain. One is called the task positive network. And when we use this one, doing the work we need to do on a daily basis, both the default network and the social network kind of fades in the background, and we are not using them as much. So how do you switch from being extremely busy to being more, taking the time to have the water cooler conversation and be more gentle towards people in our responses, or even taking the time not to cancel the one-on-one that we have with our team members, which is happening quite a lot. And I think it's the brain of people is so stressed that they don't want to have the water cooler conversation. So that's a big problem.
Yeah, the way you put it is, how do we make the switch? And I can tell you that for 40 years, I didn't even realize that there was a switch. And so, like you were saying, metacognition, meta-awareness, even just sharing that with people, it may be a revelation that, oh yeah, you know what? I do have a switch. And if I practice it, and then it becomes a habit. That habit of starting a meeting, instead of jumping right into the bottom line in the spreadsheet, how was your weekend? How's your family? How's your dog? And some people would say that, well, that's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. But I think if you look at the bottom line, teams like you were alluding to at Google in their research, teams that have that sense of trust, safety, and belonging are much more efficient and much more productive and profitable.
Yeah. It's an educational matter. We can't get tired of educating people. Whoever has access to this knowledge, or we love to acquire this knowledge, we have to continue the teachings. And there are so many more people now interested in this field, which is encouraging.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you before, tell us a little bit about the book. Well, what can we learn from reading your book?
So the book is, it's called Just One Heart. It's a cardiologist's guide to healing, health, and happiness. And you might say, well, wait, that's a lot to talk about in a single book. It's too complicated. And what I'm finding is that the path to healing, which I've been studying for 25 years, the path to happiness, and the path to health are really, they have at their core the same basic principles. And there are so many books out right now that tell you, well, do these 5 things, or here's the hacks, and just get a good night's sleep, and just eat enough bananas, or whatever it is. I think we're losing a sense of the holistic approach, and we're getting overly focused on individual techniques. And so in my research, I interviewed 50 experts from around the world in mind-body medicine, like Dean Ornish and Dan Siegel and a couple of other people, really asking, how can we approach well-being in a holistic way? And I take the lens as a heart doctor of what are the qualities of the human heart? Because maybe they will serve as a guide. Because in ancient Egypt, in ancient Hindu cultures, etc., every ancient tradition talks about the heart as being part of the solution towards human suffering. And so I found that there are these 7 timeless traits of the human heart, which all religions support. And modern science is now showing that people who demonstrate these traits tend to have better physical health, emotional well-being, social connection, and a richer spiritual life. And very briefly, the 7 traits which I discuss, the first is steadiness. So just like the emergency room patient, I need to steady the heartbeat of my patient. Well, we have to come in. You and I talked at the very top of the conversation about steadiness and calm. So the first is steadiness. The second is wisdom. The heart has a wisdom. The third is openness. So we have to be open. We have to have a beginner's mind and curiosity. And then we can come towards a wholeness. And the root of the word health and healing means wholeness. And we don't have to be without disease, without sickness in order to be whole. It's more of a psychological and a spiritual sense. Are we broken or are we whole? And in our society now, we tend to view people as either broken and needing fixing or somewhere else. And so I think that's a dangerous way to approach medicine and health, to try to find out how everyone is broken, instead of what positive psychology looks at, which is, let's look at what it means to flourish and thrive as a human. And then the last 3 traits are courage, lightness, and warmth is the ultimate trait of the heart. Warmth is about empathy, compassion, etc. But we can't jump straight into compassion. We have to learn to work with our fear, to be open-minded, wholehearted, a bit courageous, to be bold and to be different, and also to find ways to find lightheartedness when the world can be very, very heavy. So that's what the book is about. It's about how our hearts have become disconnected. That's the first part of the book. Socially, emotionally, spiritually, etc. And the second part are about these 7 timeless traits of the heart and how we can develop them and become better leaders, better spouses, better parents.
That's a fantastic synthesis of your book, and I can't wait to read it. Very interesting. And when I think about warmth, for example, what do you think in your experience of interacting with people that some people continue their life based on, their upbringing, and they are warmth by nature, while other cultures, maybe they are more cut off and they are more envious or jealous, and the task matters more than wasting time at the water cooler. What is the difference between the people
Yeah.
from different cultures? So is it the
I-
customs, or is it the genetics, or what is it?
So there's a couple parts to that question. The big question that I'm hearing is this old debate between nurture versus nature. Are we born kind? And then the culture, whether we were raised in Southeast Asia or Africa or New York City, does that determine us? The same thing, it's genetics. And even the field of psychology, which talks about personalities and core personality traits of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, etc. Even that's shifting now, Sylvia, the way that we think about it. 20, 30 years ago, I think psychologists viewed us as much more fixed and rigid.
Yes.
in terms of we're born in a certain way and you can't change it. You can't teach an old dog new tricks.
That's
And
right.
so I think your emphasis on the culture is very wise and it's very important, because I do think that we are born, all of us, with the capacity for deep compassion and connection. We're wired for connection. In fact, we can't survive without connection. We may tell ourselves that we can, but if you look at people who are fiercely individualistic, fiercely competitive, they want to do everything themselves, they don't want to ask for help, these are people who are suffering in one way or another. They may have a fancy car, but they also may have early heart disease. And so I do tend to think that with discoveries in the field of neuroscience, neuroplasticity from the 1970s and 80s, the field of genetics and epigenetics, which tell us that the way that we inherit our genes from our parents, it's not necessarily our destiny. And I can tell you as a heart doctor, it gives tremendous comfort to my patients when I tell them that just because their father died of a heart attack at the age of 50 does not mean that they're going down that same pathway. So Sylvia, my simple answer is there's tremendous hope for all of us. We're all born with the capacities of the heart and these traits of the heart. And we may be raised in an environment that teaches us to be afraid, that teaches us to compete, and that encourages our more tribalistic behaviors, sometimes very necessary for survival. And there also is this evolutionary process we all go through, some of us later in our lives than others, where we return to these qualities of heart and we get away from these neurotic habits of the mind that lead to anxiety and depression.
Exactly. And one of the biggest problems in our societies today, and in America, I know it's a big problem, is the sense of loneliness that people are experiencing. And what recommendations do you have for families or for even leaders in the workplace to minimize and to help with this issue?
It's such an important question, Sylvia, and I love that you're emphasizing that. I'm very proud of the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. This global conversation about loneliness, he is a leader here. He wrote a book on loneliness and he released from our government. He could have pointed to so many different issues, and he said that the number one problem we have is social isolation, because without social connection, we become sick. And so the first tips that I would say, and this is not intuitive, the first tip most people would say is if you're lonely, go find someone else. And in my own experience and working with many of other people, the first step to curing loneliness is becoming comfortable being alone with ourselves and developing a relationship with ourselves. I don't have to be with another person in order to feel at home and a sense of belonging and connection. I can, through my breath work, through my imagination, through remembering my mother, my father, friends, or one person in my life who was kind to me, I can develop a compassion towards myself, self-compassion. So I really firmly believe that self-compassion is one of the first steps to ending loneliness. Now, many of us may already have self-compassion, but because of COVID and lockdown and work from home and Zoom, we don't have the water cooler and the cubicle to go make small talk. This is where we have to think outside the box, literally, and find new ways to connect. And it may just be more text messages, more phone calls. I think, like so many things, Sylvia, once we become aware of how important something is, the answers tend to reveal themselves. I think the real problem is that we forget how important social connection is. And I also think that half of the population gets it wrong, the introverts among us. And I think that's part of the conversation about loneliness. People say, well, I'm an introvert, so I should be alone. And I think that's confusing the issue. There's a difference between solitude and enjoying that and isolation, which it really has to do with the way we interpret it, and our body's physiology shifts depending on whether we're enjoying solitude or whether we're suffering isolation. And so just because we're introverts or we're shy doesn't mean we're destined to be alone. We can push the edges of our personality type to connect with others and enjoy all of the health and well-being benefits of social connection.
Yes, and personality is not fixed because, the brain is plastic. We grow new connections. And I remember I was quite shy as a girl growing up, and that continued to be until I was 35. And one day I said, actually, I will stop saying that I'm shy. I will, just stop that. And
Mm,
that's the moment it started to shift. And now I don't consider myself a shy person. I'm introverted, and I
mm,
like to take time for myself and reflect and do all the things that an introvert does and read books. But I'm not necessarily shy, which is something that can let you down, because when you need to
mm,
network or when you need to go to a party and talk to people that could be good for your business, for example, you don't do it.
mm,
So we can all change, and this is one of the beautiful things about the brain. It can
mm,
surprise us, and I guess that in connection with a good heart, we can achieve more than what we think we could achieve
mm,
in the past. So, in terms of leadership, and what would be your recommendation for what is it that leaders need to learn, and to have healthier workplaces, and to lead the way? Because some leaders get it, but it's not the majority. I can
yeah.
count with with my fingers the best leaders I've met in my life, and they're not that many.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to approach leadership, and there are probably as many frameworks and models and approaches to leadership as there are leaders in the world. I like to boil it down to thinking again about using the mind versus using the heart, the emotional heart. And I think the best leaders are able to alternate between the rational, planning, thinking, logistical, day-to-day operations, looking into the future. These would be more mental and cognitive activities, and balance those with the fact that to be a leader, it doesn't mean to make profits. We have to
Yeah,
separate that. To
yeah,
be a leader means to inspire other people, to empower other people, to unite other people, to take courageous and bold action in times of uncertainty. And so, in order to do that, we can't just be using our rational cognitive mind. We have to tap into, express, be comfortable with, be vulnerable with, be honest about sharing the more emotional aspects of our being with others. Because at the end of the day, if humans want to lead humans, we have to lead from the head and also from the heart. And so, I think the next generation of leaders will develop very strong skills, both on the cognitive side and also on the emotional, social, and even spiritual side, which taps into that core human need for a sense of purpose and meaning. And every consulting company, whether it's McKinsey or Deloitte, have shown the same thing, which is if you want people to be more productive, don't pay them more necessarily. That would be nice. Allow them to feel a deep sense of connection and meaning with the work that they're doing, and their productivity will go up 400%.
that's correct. I saw the latest McKinsey survey results about the sense of meaning and purpose is as high as people wanted to make money from the business. So
Mm.
it's very together, these two results, and we need to take that into consideration. There's a lot of requests about finding life purpose, and how do we find purpose and meaning in our work. And I guess that this is happening in America as well. And what would your recommendation be for that?
So the recommendation would be, so I agree with that, and it would be very simple. I think we tend to complicate things when it comes to purpose. The first thing is to get clear about purpose, because you can either believe that you, Sylvia, have one purpose in your life, and there's only one destiny for you, and you've got to find that thing in order to be happy. I used to believe that, but I think that that's a very limiting way of approaching the sense of purpose and meaning. I think another way to look at it is to say that we all have many possible purposes in our life, and we can have a short-term purpose and a long-term purpose, and a purpose that overrides our entire life. Purpose is to be kind, to help other people, whatever it is. So that's the first thought that I have on purpose and meaning. The second is, I think if we all look back on our lives, we can remember moments when we felt tremendous joy, immersion in our activity, a sense of connection with other people, feeling good about what we were doing. And And I think those moments in our lives leave clues, but in the West, and now also in the East, the modern environment of work teaches us to forget those things that give us joy. It's part of our academic training, and then we have to compete to get into business school, and then after that, we have to compete one company from another. And so I do think competition tends to erode the sense of purpose that many of us have, which often is around, very simply, serving other people and feeling like we're making a positive contribution in the world.
Yeah, very well said. Fantastic take on that. So I have one last question, and this is a personal curiosity. Being the son of a quantum physicist or nuclear physicist, um, and you mentioned the word the brain and the heart are connected through neurons and chemicals and energy as well. So if you look at the history of the scientific method, which was born around Copernicus and Newton with their classist a take on science and the world and how we function as a machine, which is very different to how quantum physicists see this matter. What are the things that we need to be changing in the education system in order to adjust our mind to the fact that we are all energy and that we need to understand certain things of how we work and not fall in the trap of, the things are very mechanistic, because that's what's happening, that this transition is not clear for people, and therefore they can't work with intention or understanding how energy works between us, etc. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I think you hit the historical framework very well, and many people point to René Descartes, the French mathematician, who said that there's a separation between the mind and the body. And there are the mechanistic aspects of being human, and then there are more ethereal and spiritual aspects. Without getting into a whole conversation about the history of religion and the history of spirituality, I think a very practical answer to your question is we teach our children that life isn't just about getting more for me and for my people, that the real beauty in life is connecting with others as human beings and in embracing the wholeness of our experience, including the tears and the pain, and not trying to push that away or to hide it. And then as we get older, the same thing, not trying to fight the aging process and to live to be 1,000 years old, while forgetting that there's no point in living unless we experience the joys and the sorrows together in a sense of community. So I know you began the question with sort of metaphysical and quantum physics and energy fields. And I think behind that question, at least when I hear it, it really has to do with how do we bring more emotion and spirituality and connectedness into our lives in what otherwise is an overly mechanistic, analytical, utilitarian, transactional world.
Yes, exactly. So it's a fantastic take on this question that is bugging my mind about, so many things need to change in order for us to trust that the heart has the wisdom that we need to live. And our minds are not yet into that space. Talking to you as a cardiologist and a well-being leader creates a clarity for whoever is listening, because you can talk about the physical benefits. You have seen them in your patients, but most people don't have that exposure. So I hope that the conversation today with Dr. Jonathan Fisher has been enlightening. It has certainly been for me, and I would love to continue talking with you for hours, but our program has to end for today. So thank you so much for your presence and for your wisdom and your knowledge. It's been a wonderful experience.
Oh, Sylvia, it's been such a pleasure, and I love the work you're doing and bringing such awareness around the world to the power of the mind, the power of the heart, and the emphasis on becoming the leaders that will lead the next generation towards more connection. So thank you for that.
You're most welcome.